I have reviewed the Epstein files that were produced last Friday by Donald Trump's Department of Justice repeatedly and carefully, and what I want to do here is walk through, in a clear and non-conspiratorial way, exactly what is contained in those documents as it relates to references involving Vladimir Putin, Russia, Russian oligarchs, and the intersections those references have with the first Trump administration and the current Trump regime, because the only responsible way to discuss material of this magnitude is to show people what is actually written in the emails, the text messages, and the investigative reports themselves, and allow each viewer to reach their own conclusions. And as a reminder, what was released last Friday, more than 3 million documents, is not the full production, because by all accounts there remain at least 3 million additional documents still withheld, which by conservative estimates could amount to anywhere from 25 million to 50 million pages that have not yet been produced, and based on my prior experience as a litigator, partial productions of this nature often mean that the most sensitive and consequential material is still being held back. But even within what has already been released, there are significant and deeply concerning disclosures, particularly as they relate to Jeffrey Epstein's documented interactions with Russian political power. Beginning with one of the earliest references, I have found an email dated November 8, 2010, sent by Jeffrey Epstein, in which he asks, in plain language, whether he needs to obtain a visa and whether he should reach out to a friend of Putin to resolve the matter, a casual phrasing that already suggests access rather than aspiration, and that tone continues in subsequent communications, including an email dated May 21st, 2013, sent by Epstein to Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel, a central figure in Israel's security and defense establishment, in which Epstein writes that Putin asked that I meet with him in St. Petersburg the same time as his economic conference, adding that he declined unless Putin was willing to set aside real time and privacy, language that again conveys familiarity rather than conjecture. And this is not an isolated message, but part of a pattern of correspondence that places Epstein in regular communication with heads of state, former prime ministers, and senior diplomatic figures across Europe and the Middle East, and those emails are reinforced by photographic evidence contained in files showing Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell together in Russia, wearing Russian paraphernalia. Images that by themselves prove nothing, but in context reinforce the documentary record of repeated Russian travel and engagement. And then there is an email dated September 11th, 2011, sent from an unidentified account to Epstein referencing a man named Igor, described as someone with close ties to Putin, in which the sender recounts that Igor believed Epstein had told him during a previous visit to Palm Beach that he had an appointment with Putin scheduled for September 16th, and that Igor should book his ticket to Russia accordingly, noting further that Igor had looked into security arrangements in Sochi for Epstein, and that regardless of scheduling changes, Igor still needed to travel to Russia to address issues with his passport, after which he would return to New York and potentially travel back with Epstein later that month. A level of logistical coordination that is difficult to reconcile with casual or speculative contact. And the release files also include communications from Epstein discussing the death of Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, in which Epstein characterizes Maxwell as having been killed after threatening to expose Mossad operations unless he was given hundreds of millions of pounds to save his collapsing business empire, describing Maxwell as someone who had free access to Margaret Thatcher's Downing Street, Ronald Reagan's White House, the Kremlin, and corridors of power throughout Europe, and who, according to Epstein, functioned as an unofficial intermediary between Israel and the Soviet bloc, passing secrets to Israeli intelligence while being tolerated for his excesses, a narrative that, while originating with Epstein himself and therefore requiring careful scrutiny, nevertheless reflects how Epstein understood and described the intelligence-linked world in which he operated, and that understanding becomes more significant when viewed alongside an FBI report dated November 27, 2017, summarizing a meeting between FBI special agents and a newly established confidential human source, in which the source states that Epstein maintained a compound in New Mexico and a private island where underage girls were lured and recorded, and then makes the striking assertion that Epstein was Vladimir Putin's wealth manager, providing similar services to Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, a claim attributed to a confidential informant and therefore not a judicial finding, but nonetheless documented in official FBI records, And the same body of evidence shows that on March 18, 2014, the very day Vladimir Putin announced Russia's annexation of Crimea, Epstein emailed French banker Ariane de Rothschild stating that the upheaval in Ukraine should provide many opportunities. A remark that gains added significance when read in light of the FBI sources' claim about Epstein's financial role and his documented pattern of engaging with geopolitical disruption as a business prospect. And further reinforcing this pattern is a series of emails involving Thorbjorn Jagland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, former Foreign Minister, and former Secretary General of the Council of Europe, in which Epstein suggests that Jagland relayed to Putin that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov could gain valuable insight by speaking directly with Epstein, referencing the late Vitaly Churkin, Russia's former ambassador to the United Nations who died suddenly in New York in 2017, noting that Churkin used to speak with him, and Jagland responded that he will meet with Lavrov's assistant and pass along suggestion, thanking Epstein for a recent meeting and commenting that another diplomat understood Trump after their conversation, framing global political tensions in transactional terms. And it is difficult to ignore the historical resonance of these exchanges when recalling that Lavrov and Ambassador Sergei Kislyak were the first senior foreign officials invited into the Trump White House in 2017, a meeting during which classified information was disclosed, a fact later acknowledged by Trump himself. And throughout these communications, Epstein repeatedly positions himself as a conduit between political power, financial systems, and intelligence figures, even at one point expressing interest in helping Putin reinvent the financial system. Language that again appears in an email to Jagland dated May 14, 2013, and while none of these documents by themselves establish criminal liability or prove the truth of every assertion contained within them, taken together, they form a documentary record that shows Epstein consistently portray himself as someone with access to Vladimir Putin, Russian oligarchs, senior Russian diplomats, and intelligence-adjacent figures, and doing so across multiple years, multiple administrations, and multiple geopolitical flashpoints. And that is why it matters that millions of additional documents remain unproduced, because the material already released demonstrates that Epstein's role extended far beyond that of a disgraced financier operating in isolation, and instead places him at the intersection of global finance, intelligence, and political power. And my purpose in laying this out is not to assert conclusions, but to show clearly and transparently what the documents themselves say. Because once you read the emails, the texts, and the report in their own words, the question is no longer whether these connections existed, but what they meant, who understood them at the time, and why so much of this material remains hidden even now. As I continue examining the Epstein files produced by Donald Trump's Department of Justice, it becomes apparent that the released emails, text messages, and calendar entries paint a detailed, and at times, extraordinary portrait of Jeffrey Epstein's interactions with high-level political and financial figures across multiple countries, including the Russian Federation and its leadership. And while my intention here is not to speculate or draw unverified conclusions, the documents themselves allow us to trace repeated and consistent references to Vladimir Putin, Russian oligarchs, key Russian diplomats, and the intricate web of international connections that Epstein maintained over years, beginning with communications that explicitly position Epstein as an intermediary between world leaders and influential figures in Russia, such as the emails regarding planned meetings with Putin, which include a note about investors traveling to Sochi 1 year, and again to St. Petersburg on June 20th, with Epstein commenting that prior meetings did not work and that the structure or scale of ideas were insufficient, while simultaneously suggesting that he was in a unique position to create something grand, likening it to the Sputnik initiative during the space race, and emphasizing his personal access and credibility by mentioning his advisory relationship with Bill Gates and asserting confidential proximity to power. And these messages demonstrate a careful cultivation of influence, which continues with documentation of a lunch meeting on October 7th, 2016, organized by Epstein's assistant, placed his girlfriend, Karianna Shulak, in a position of responsibility to coordinate between Epstein, Peter Thiel, and Vitaly Churkin, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, who was a close confidant of Putin and who would die under mysterious circumstances in New York a year later. And this same period coincides with Thiel taking positions that diverge from the broader Silicon Valley consensus, including his endorsement of Donald Trump at the Republican National Convention, illustrating Epstein's proximity to individuals who were both politically and technologically influential. And one day after this lunch, Epstein emails Thiel a link to John Podesta's hacked emails on WikiLeaks, with Podesta being a central figure in Hillary Clinton's campaign and former chief advisor, a fact that underscores the simultaneous intersection of Epstein's networks with both Russian officials and American political operatives. And the scheduling of these meetings was deliberate, as indicated by follow-up emails discussing logistics and participants, reflecting a high-level planning rather than casual correspondence. And in parallel communications, Epstein refers to potential meetings with Putin in 2013, writing to Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel, that Putin had requested a meeting in St. Petersburg coinciding with an economic conference, which Epstein declined unless there was sufficient time and privacy. And this reference is consistent with a pattern of positioning himself as a key intermediary, while a 2014 communication suggests that Epstein was encouraged to read about Alexander Dugin, a known advisor to Putin, implying that Epstein and his associates were actively tracking ideological and strategic figures in Russia, a point reinforced by an email describing leisure activities on Epstein's private island with Ghislaine Maxwell, including skydiving and scuba diving, juxtaposed with discussions of international meetings, indicating a blending of personal and professional spheres. And analysts like Peter Jukes have observed that individuals such as Steve Bannon appear to have been working alongside Epstein in strategic capacities, sometimes formally and sometimes informally, with respect to leaders like Ehud Barak, creating a bridge between American political advisors and foreign leaders with direct access to Putin. And the communications contain messages confirming planning for events and meetings, including statements like, "We are set for Nome on Saturday," and instructions on preparing key individuals for discussions, illustrating the operational coordination required to facilitate these high-level interactions, with references to electoral campaigns, international advisories, and strategic messaging that were planned months or even years in advance. And emails from May 15, 2013 and July 20, 2014 indicate that Epstein's calendar was used to schedule preparations for meetings with Putin, including coordinating with business figures like Joy Ito and Reid Hoffman, and further messages show engagement with Thorbjorn Jagland, former Norwegian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, discussing meetings with Putin and Lavrov, alongside references to Sultan bin Salman of the United Arab Emirates, one of the wealthiest individuals in the UAE with known connections to Russia, all of which underscores that these were not casual musings, but conversations involving world leaders, diplomats, and billionaires. And the correspondence also reflects sensitivity to geopolitical events, as seen in Epstein's notes regarding plane crashes and terrorism affecting the timing of potential meetings with Putin, and additional communications from Nicholas Rybus in January 2019 highlight ongoing discussions around Russia and finance, reinforcing Epstein's sustained interest in Russian economic strategy, including discussions of a sophisticated Russian version of Bitcoin as early as 2014, reflecting both awareness and engagement with financial technologies at the highest level. And these threads of communication extend over years, including October 2010, July 2015, October 2017, and mid-2018, where Epstein consistently seeks to arrange meetings to discuss economic, technological, and political developments directly with Putin or his senior officials. And these engagements often intersected with other influential figures, such as Peter Mandelson, former UK ambassador to the United States, with whom Epstein discussed arrangements akin to a Putin-Medvedev deal, implying coordination on high-level political strategies. And the files further suggest involvement in monitoring and potentially influencing electoral developments in multiple countries, including discussions around Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and key elections in Slovakia and Montenegro, demonstrating that Epstein's communications were not merely financial but spanned international politics and strategy, with multiple emails dated August 2016 showing planning for European trips, meetings with Putin, Lavrov, and Medvedev, and coordination with foreign leaders, all occurring prior to the November 2016 U.S. presidential election. And this complex web of correspondence continued into the Trump administration, where the first officials welcomed into the White House included Sergei Lavrov and Sergei Kislyak, illustrating continuity between Epstein's pre-election communications and the entry of Russian officials into the early Trump White House, a period during which Trump publicly dismissed concerns about Russian interference, while Epstein's files reveal his own intimate familiarity with political developments, including interactions with Steve Bannon, Elon Musk, and other figures who would hold influence in the administration, reinforcing the idea that Epstein maintained